Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michonne Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. This is Revolution to Rights America at 250, a 10-episode podcast series from Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. Revolution to Rights takes you on a journey through America's 250-year history of advancing freedom and justice since the Declaration of Independence in 1776.
The historical dramas featured in Revolution to Rights tell stories of battles fought in the quest for freedom and the people whose collective actions and courage inspire us to move beyond remembrance and to take actions today to ensure freedom and justice for all.
Benjamin Franklin, the man who discovered electricity, the wit behind Poor Richard's Almanac, the founder of the first public lending library in the American colonies, the elder statesman who signed the Declaration of Independence, and the first American Postmaster General. We thought we knew Benjamin Franklin's story. We didn't. At 70 years old, gout-ridden, ocean-weary, and without a diplomatic playbook, Franklin landed in France and pulled off one of the most audacious acts of statecraft in history. He had to charm an absolute monarchy into funding a democratic revolution. He had to outmaneuver enemies and frenemies in Versailles and in his own American delegation. And he had to do it while his own son was loyal to the British crown.
In this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, we talk with Pulitzer Prize-winning author Stacy Schiff, co-executive producer of the 2024 Apple TV series Franklin, starring Academy Award winner Michael Douglas, inspired by her award-winning book A Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America. We get into the real Franklin, the improvised diplomacy that the Continental Congress never quite understood, his fascinating and fraught partnerships with the powerful women of the French court, his bitter rivalry with John Adams, and the painful estrangement from his loyalist son, William. This is the Franklin your American history class probably left out.
2024 Apple TV series Franklin begins when Benjamin Franklin and his grandson Temple step onto French soil to begin a secret mission: secure financial and military support from France for America's war for independence from France's enemy, Great Britain. Back home, American independence hangs in the balance. But Benjamin Franklin knows without ally support, America's battle for independence will fail. With more celebrity than language fluency, this diplomatic mission becomes Franklin's greatest challenge. In addition to Michael Douglas, Franklin features Noah Jupe as Benjamin Franklin's grandson, Temple Franklin, Thibault de Montalembert as Comte de Vergennes, Daniel Mays as Edward Bancroft, Ludivine Sagnier as Madame Brillant, Eddie Marsan as John Adams, and Jeanne Balibar as Madame Helvétius.
We begin our conversation about Benjamin Franklin in France with Stacy Schiff. Stacy Schiff is the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography Vera about Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov, and A Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America, winner of the George Washington Book Prize, the inspiration for the Apple TV miniseries Franklin. Stacy Schiff's Cleopatra: A Life was a #1 bestseller translated into 35 languages, and The Witches was hailed by the New York Times as an almost novelistic, thriller-like narrative. Her most recent book, The Revolutionary Samuel Adams, appeared on President Barack Obama's favorite books of 2022. The Wall Street Journal has called Schiff perhaps the most seductive writer of nonfiction prose in America in our time. Among other honors, Stacy Schiff received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, where she has been named a Library Lion. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Stacy Schiff has been made a Chevalier des Arts et Lettres by the French government. Welcome, Stacy, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
I'm delighted to join you.
What motivated you to write about Benjamin Franklin's years in France and his role in the American Revolution?
Well, when you start a book knowing it's going to take you um, a long stretch of time, in the case of this book, 5 years, you're looking for the book that isn't on the shelf. You're looking for the book that somehow has gone missing. And I didn't see what struck me as an adequate narrative account of what Franklin felt was his greatest contribution, of what he felt was the greatest chapter of his life. And that's was a piece of history to which I could add because I had French and the archives were 90% of them in France. It has, too, the attraction of being a moment when you have someone like Franklin, who's very well documented and very, very much written about, out of context. So you see a subject very differently when you take him out of his native milieu. And there was Franklin in a place where he didn't know the social mores and didn't really effectively speak the language, and more to the point, is on what seemed an impossible errand. He's on this mission to convince a monarchy to underwrite a fledgling republic, which would seem like a fool's errand. So that it had all of those things going for it. It's Franklin at the top of his game. And in retrospect, it's the moment he will say are the years, it's 8.5 years, the years when he worked the hardest.
We're very interested in untold, undertold stories, and that's where A Great Improvisation intrigues us. And as we're approaching the 250th anniversary of the U.S. declaring its independence from Great Britain and marking its birth as a republic, one of the things that's really interesting to us is how we tell the story, that origin story. And in your book, what was surprising was that even George Washington, and probably less surprising, John Adams, not only were they kind of reluctant to give France much credit for their role in helping the United States during the American Revolution, but you even wrote that the gratitude as well was missing. And so what I'm wondering is, because this feels a little bit like, oh, the typical American, oh, yes, we don't need anybody. We can do it on our own. But how do you see the investment in that origin story of the United States playing out in our attitudes towards our international relationships and diplomacy, even in our own time?
Well, you pick up, Queen, such a good question. You pick up on one of the reasons why these years were so little written about, I think. This is the dependent side of American independence. It's not the chapter on which we would like to stress. We want to believe that George Washington did this on the battlefield and on his own. We don't want to remember that on that battlefield were Washington's troops in French-made uniforms using French-made munitions and assisted by a French Navy. So it does interfere a little bit with our idea of ourselves. If you go back to the very beginning, and I should put this in some context by saying that from a certain vantage point, the Declaration of Independence in itself is an advertisement for foreign aid. There's more consensus in Congress in 1776 about soliciting foreign aid than there even is about a rupture with Great Britain, because the understanding is until the colonies really insist on their independence, no one's going to come to their rescue. And there's not a chance in the world that they can wage this kind of war, that they can assert their independence without some kind of financial support, without the munitions and the material that a foreign power is going to provide. And everyone is pretty much already looking at France, the traditional rival of Great Britain. But in that respect, the Declaration is almost a sort of SOS. It's sort of waving the flag to a foreign power saying, could you come to our assistance? The shorthand, I think, if you can really sort of boil it down among the founders, would go something like this. George Washington wanted to win the war without any kind of French troops. John Adams wanted to win the war without any kind of political attachment to France, and Franklin wanted to win the war, period. And this is not a mission that Franklin, a year earlier even, would have smiled upon. He had really not loved the idea of a foreign alliance in any way, and he'd always been deeply suspicious of the French. So it's just kind of interesting that he's the one who ends up dispatched to France to accomplish this. But yes, it is the neglected piece of American history. It's the neglected piece of Franklin's life. And to this day, obviously, it doesn't entirely fit with our mythical sense of the war.
Stacy, we talked with Cassandra Good and Sarah Giorgini about John Adams. I mean, I've become fascinated with John Adams ever since reading David McCullough's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography. But one thing we notice in the Franklin series and other portrayals of John Adams is this contentious relationship, especially between, let's say for Franklin, between Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. What was the root cause of their conflicts, as both of them were committed to achieving the same goal? And you said, of course, John Adams had the intention of winning the war without the political influence of France, but they were both committed to the independence of the United States. Talk about that relationship. Was it a temperament thing or their regional thing? Harvard-educated New England lawyer farmer versus the Philadelphia Renaissance man and self-made entrepreneur. Tell us more about that relationship and why was it so contentious?
I could go on this subject pretty much for the rest of the day. Um, they actually have the world in common, which makes their falling out and their inability to really stand each other all that much more complicated. They're both of them hard-driving, book-loving sons of Massachusetts. Franklin's from Boston initially, even though he does as a teenager run away to Philadelphia. They're born 12 miles from each other. Obviously, John Adams has the education of which Franklin is deprived. And they work together very, very congenially for years. They meet in Congress. They both assist Thomas Jefferson in writing the Declaration. They go to see Lord Howe to discuss a potential solution to the Anglo-American conflict. Adams really looks up to Franklin, who is 29 years his elder. They couldn't be closer or more closely politically aligned. What happens when John Adams lands in France, I think, are two things. In short, as I say, it's a very complicated subject. He's sent to France to help Franklin to deliver an alliance with the French, an alliance which Franklin completes just before John Adams arrives. So John Adams, first of all, arrives to find out he doesn't have a job. And then he doesn't have a great deal to do, and so he'll spend the next months and years, and he's in France twice, in fact, writing home incessantly about what he sees are the misdeeds of Benjamin Franklin. And he sees the misdeeds on two fronts, and those basically come in the categories of Franklin's embrace of France and France's embrace of Franklin. And on the first subject, I think this touches on what you mentioned, which is the gratitude that America should feel toward a benefactor who's going to help it achieve its independence. That was a very uncomfortable posture for John Adams. He didn't really like to express his gratitude to this somewhat decadent, quite decadent in his mind, foreign court. He wanted America very much to sail on her own. But what stuck even more deeply in the craw, if something can stick deeply in a craw, was the French embrace of Franklin. Franklin is in France a universal celebrity. He's applauded in the streets. His portrait appears on snuff boxes and walking sticks and wallpaper. Everyone knows who he is. Everyone in France thinks that he is a friend to all mankind. As John Adams will say, there are more panegyrics written to Franklin than to any man who ever lived. And that kind of celebrity is something that on which John Adams really chokes. And Franklin enjoys it, but more importantly, Franklin sees it as a very useful tool in terms of American diplomacy. And to Adams, it is only a sort of vile mark of character. He sees it as a real weakness on Franklin's part, that he's sort of eating up this adulation. And Franklin, of course, is seeing the adulation as a way of serving Congress and getting it what it needs to wage a war. And I should say there's some fault on Franklin's side as well. He sees very clearly that Adams does not look upon him happily, which makes him less inclined to share information with John Adams. So he's reluctant to explain himself, and he's not necessarily cooperative. His accounts are a quagmire, with which he's well aware. He can be peremptory. He can be very vague. He can be very disorganized. There's fault on both sides, and I think David McCullough comes down on the Adams side, and I come down on the Franklin side. But it's clear that the diplomacy or the gift for diplomacy belongs to one man only, and that's Franklin. And when John Adams approaches the court of Versailles, it is pretty much a bull in a china shop kind of diplomacy.
This is interesting too. Living in DC, we meet quite a few people who work in diplomacy and international relations, etc. And they'll kind of tell us that you have to be attuned to the context you're working in. That in some places, being more direct and hard-nosed, the way John Adams was, works, and in others, the way that Franklin approached diplomacy is the better tack. So I'm thinking about the time in which both these men were living, the country and the context of that they were culturally dealing with. And so I'm interested in how you saw those differences, like Franklin's approach, allowing him to succeed specifically in his relations with the French minister Vergennes, where Adams was kind of flailing. And I think there was one point in your book where I saw Vergennes didn't even want to meet with Adams. And there were a bunch of other people that got sent, but the only person he really wanted to deal with, once he decided to deal with the Americans, was Franklin.
Yeah, we should really give a salute here, a call out to Vergennes, who's the French Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the person who really is masterminding, first, the covert underwriting of the American cause, but later, obviously, the supplying of Washington's troops, and who's doing this entirely to undermine Great Britain. He's not doing this out of any love of American liberty, and in fact doesn't really believe that there will ever be a United States of America, or if there is, that it will ever really endure. So he's doing this entirely for expedient political reasons of his own. But Vergennes and Franklin have an extremely they respect each other, and they have an extremely close relationship. And it is Vergennes' nightmare to have John Adams in the mix. At several junctures, he asks if he could please be deprived of John Adams's company. To your point about where we are today, Franklin is inventing the American Foreign Service. There is no understanding of how to deal on an international stage and with these very established powers and in the language of diplomacy. He's having to figure this out largely without the help of Congress because it takes so long to get word back and forth. And even when you do get word back and forth, or when you send word, it doesn't always arrive because so much is intercepted along the way. So Franklin is sort of manufacturing this, but the art of diplomacy and the character of Ben Franklin are very well suited for each other. He's a man of great nuance and flexibility, which is the opposite of John Adams. And that is part of the reason why Vergennes finds him to be a very satisfying partner in a very troubled and often very volatile exercise.
And I would say, given how you present the France of the time, also a more flexible culture maybe than the one that Adams was coming from, is New England.
I do think, you put your finger on it, I do think some of the objection of John Adams to Ben Franklin is that he sees how Franklin has taken to France and how France has taken to Franklin, and that can only mean that Franklin has sold his dissipated soul. And honestly, the insults that Franklin and Adams exchange about each other, behind each other's backs, are really priceless. At one point, John Adams calls Franklin the love child of Machiavelli and the Jesuits, the greatest.
Oh, my.
Right, and then he goes and says the greatest imposter since Mohammed. He just can't get over the frivolity with which he sees Franklin comporting himself, which by any other definition is something we might call diplomacy.
John Adams wasn't the only American diplomat that criticized and distrusted Benjamin Franklin. There's Arthur Lee, and I am just so through with the Lee brothers after reading your book. They're not in the series, correct? The Lee brothers. I don't recall seeing them.
They got left by the wayside. Yes.
Good. I am so glad. The other is Ralph Izard as well. Is it Izard? Did I get that right?
Izard, I think.
Izard. And they were Southern elites. How might the differences in class and region have influenced these men's relationships? We talked about Adams and his New England creds, and Benjamin Franklin and his Boston to Philadelphia creds. So now we're in the South. We're dealing with Virginia and South Carolina, respectively. After watching the PBS series, The American Revolution by Ken Burns, we wondered, would you say that their relationship reflected the challenges the 13 colonies faced in unifying against Britain? Because the South seems to be an issue from day one.
Yeah, but funny how no one saw that coming. Vergennes actually is the person who very early on when he's talking about, when he's reassuring the king that he has no worries, this America thing is never going to take flight. It's never really going to amount to anything. And he says, the North and the South will never cohere. They have nothing in common. They are socially and politically and culturally foreign to each other. This country will never hold together. They will be at each other's throats before you can believe it. And of course, he turns out to be in some respect right. To be fair to the Lee brothers and Azard, they are all of them sitting in Paris waiting to be sent to foreign courts which have refused to receive them. So again, like John Adams, they are sort of stalled in Paris. So they're frustrated to begin. And again, as with John Adams, Franklin is not necessarily cooperative with them. They are questioning everything he's doing. They're questioning his accounts. They're asking him for monies because he is, of course, the distributor of what little funds the Americans have. And Franklin isn't finding this to be terribly useful. And so he can be a little bit, as I said, peremptory and uncommunicative with them as well. It is also true, however, that there is a class difference very much at work here. One of them will say it's to be hoped that in future Congress would send representatives who are gentlemen, who are fit to move in these kinds of circles. And they're talking about Franklin. They deplore Franklin, whom they see as sort of lower class, in his self-made, uneducated way. And they kind of make a specialty of proposing more sensible uses of Franklin's time. At one point, one of them suggests he could be sent to Vienna, and then one of them suggests he might be sent to Russia, where he could do no harm. There's a real contempt here for Franklin, to which he adds to some extent. He adds fuel to the fire, obviously, by not playing along with them. But they do write him venomous letters, and he, being Franklin, often responds venomously, but then doesn't send the letters. He's smart enough to, for the most part, to tuck those letters into his desk drawer. So, we can see a good deal of the correspondence that was going back and forth, which is poisonous, but most of it poisonous on the other side from those sort of half colleagues or full colleagues. I should say, before I say anything more before I completely trash the Lee brothers, Franklin gets along with precisely one colleague until the arrival of Thomas Jefferson. So, the common denominator here is Franklin. But these are men who do treat him. At one point, Franklin says to Arthur Lee, "I don't want to be treated like one of your servants." He's extremely condescending with Franklin. And again, very suspicious of what Franklin is doing, both at court and with American funds and with his time. These are all men who are bent on American independence, so I would not say that their differences point in any way to the differences in getting the independence movement off the ground in America. They are men who ultimately will find themselves on different sides when it comes to slavery, but it's the very end of Franklin's life. That's much later.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, just to understand that even in the American Revolution, there were multiple motivations for why people participated on one side or the other, or took one side or another. So I think that's something also to keep in mind, that in any political situation, you're trying to find common ground, but often it takes a lot of work because people do come with their own interests.
Absolutely.
For sure.
And also I think the thing we forget is how late in the game many of these people come to independence, if only because not only is it a radical concept, but it was a word you didn't dare speak aloud. So I think almost every founder says something to the effect of that no one, drunk or sober, had uttered the word independence before 1775 at the earliest. Yeah. It just, a rupture with the mother country just seems, to most people anyway, if not wrong-headed, at least ridiculously bold.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama films and series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Share the excitement with your friends. Visit MichonneBostonGroup.com/Boston Sisters. Join the historical drama community by signing up for our e-newsletter so you'll never miss an update, future episodes, or exclusive bonus content.
Now, back to our fascinating conversation. Another area of history that is getting told more is the role of women in the American Revolution and women's role in a sphere of politics when they weren't able to vote or hold office, or many instances were still kind of viewed as the property of their husbands. And we spoke with Cassandra Good and Sarah Giorgini about women's roles in the revolution, and particularly from Cassandra's book, Founding Friendships, about mixed sex friendships and how women influence politics and society through friendships. And A Great Improvisation includes Franklin's friendships with two aristocratic women, Madame Brillant and the widow, Madame Hervétus. And so we're interested in, how did French women's friendships with powerful men give them influence in politics? I'm assuming it was a little bit different from the way it operated here in the United States. And how did those friendships facilitate his celebrity and his political diplomacy in France?
And this, of course, will take us back to John Adams, because if there's yet another thing about Ben Franklin that will irritate John Adams, it is his popularity with the women of France, because that is deeply, and remember, Franklin at this point is a widower, but the fact that he is on these close terms and these close physical terms with a great number of aristocratic women makes him yet more odious in the eyes of his colleague, John Adams. Um, this is a moment of great female influence in France. And by female influence, I should say upper class, aristocratic female influence. The drawing rooms of Paris, the court of Versailles, are very much female heavy. They're places where women dominate and where women bring together the great thinkers of the day. Female wit was of great premium. Everyone is repeating around town what so-and-so has said in another woman's salon. There's a great deal of, not necessarily diplomacy, but influence that's peddled in those rooms, something that Franklin comes to understand very quickly. And indeed, he makes very close friends with two near neighbors, one immediate neighbor, one slightly farther away. Madame Brillant, who's a beautiful woman in her mid-30s who lives just around the corner, really, with whom Franklin has an extremely flirtatious relationship, who's well-connected, not connected necessarily at court, but who ultimately will be the person who will introduce him to the envoy who will set the effort to make a peace in motion. So that while there had been a behind-the-scenes understanding that it was time to negotiate a peace, it's actually an introduction that Madame Brillant makes for Franklin that sends the envoy to Paris, who will actually sit down and talk to the Americans about a peace treaty. Franklin's journal, actually, of the peace negotiation begins with Madame Brillant, and he will say great affairs often take their rise from small circumstances, because she had made this initial overture had come through her. And then Madame Helvétius, who's the other one of his two favorites, is a much older woman. She's the widow of a famous philosopher, and she's a little bit of a bohemian. She lives a little bit further away in this kind of extraordinary estate surrounded by gardens and filled with animals. She loved to dress her cats in satins and damask and things, and the cats and the dogs had the run of her place. But she also filled it with thinkers, with clerics, and with influential men. And it was there that Franklin met a great number of people who would go on to assist with the American effort at court. Being in the good favor of these kinds of women and these kinds of rooms was of a tremendous political advantage, and that was something that Franklin really plays brilliantly. There's an echo chamber in a funny way between what is happening at court and what is happening in the finest of these drawing rooms.
And that's shown very well in the series, because both these women are very distinctive. It seems that they're based on what you said, there's no template for what being a woman of the court is. I mean, probably in terms of dress and fashion, but definitely each one had their own personality, their own interests.
I also think it's, remarkable that Franklin is able to fall in with these women as naturally as he does. He's never met this breed of woman before. This is no English woman, no highborn English woman with whom he has spent time resembles these creations, these French women who are both so steely and so seductive. And he just takes to it very naturally. I mean, this is Franklin. Franklin's always very good with women. He's not always charming, I shouldn't say that. He's always extremely good at understanding a female point of view. And he takes to this as if it's natural for him, which at his, he's in his 70s when he arrives in France. It's sort of a remarkable feat.
Yeah. His what he achieves in his 70s is actually encouraging, I would say. Oh, so sticking with in the realm of relationship, one of the other aspects that came out through your book is the relationship between Benjamin Franklin and his son William Franklin. Maybe we should say the kind of torn relationship. And it seems in some ways to echo the kinds of divides we see happening because of politics, even in families today. And I was wondering, how did their differing loyalties make it so difficult for Franklin to reconcile with his son, who remained loyal to the crown? Um, and Franklin, of course, who was very much the man for the independence. But even after the American Revolution was over and the U.S. Had settled and Britain had accepted the U.S.'s independence as a nation, they still weren't able to reconcile. So, what do you think made that impossible for them to restore that father-son relationship?
Yeah, that's a relationship that is as close at the beginning as it is sort of devastatingly impossible to put back together at the end. William is his father's best friend. He's there when Franklin is toying with electricity. He's there when Franklin is in London for years attempting to palliate some of the American complaints. He's his father's closest political associate. He's the keeper of his secrets. When William Franklin is made royal governor of New Jersey, his father rejoices. This is a huge coup for the Franklin family. I should add that William Franklin is Franklin's illegitimate son. So the fact that he's able to overcome what John Adams, for example, would call the blemish of his birth and become a royal governor is a particular note. Um, all is fine and dandy until the run up to the Revolution, when William he's the last royal governor to remain loyal to the crown. He is ultimately arrested for passing information to the British troops, and he is imprisoned. And when he's imprisoned, a request goes to his father for some kind of clemency. He asks if his father might intervene in some way. And Franklin appears never to have lifted a finger. I mean, it would have been an almost impossible thing for him to have done. But he doesn't divert from his own beliefs, and he doesn't do anything to help William, who ultimately is traded in a prisoner exchange and sent to London. So that by the time Franklin goes to France, um, William is in London. Franklin is an English channel away, but the two of them have no contact whatsoever during the war. And this is complicated by the fact that Franklin, when he sails to France in 1776, months after the Declaration, takes with him, and who will serve as his personal secretary, William's son. So in a funny way, he has exchanged grandson for son. And William Temple Franklin, called Temple, who was with Franklin through the French years, will also not have any contact with his father during those 8.5 years. The very end of Franklin's stay in France, he lets it be known through an intermediary that he would welcome an overture from his son. And William writes to him and asks if they might get together and if they might somehow reconcile. But he makes clear that he has no regret about what he's done, that if he were to have to face the same choice over again, his duty had been to the king and he had fulfilled his duty to the king. And Franklin doesn't wait terribly long before answering that letter with kind of a grenade in which he makes clear that, without using the word, that he has been embarrassed, terribly embarrassed by the fact that his son has spent the war on the opposite side, that this has been a shameful thing for him to have to live with, and essentially says to William, there are personal loyalties which trump all political loyalties. He basically says you could have remained neutral, that would have been acceptable, but to have taken a position against me and against all I stand for was unacceptable. William asks if he can come to Paris so they can talk it through. Franklin resists that idea. And the two of them see each other only once again as Franklin is about to sail back to America in 1785 in the summer. And all three Franklin generations will then meet in Southampton. And Franklin at that point actually asks his son to transfer his American properties to his grandson in a deal which was pretty much the worst possible deal that William Franklin could have signed, about which he's quite angry. And Franklin is very displeased with him for having balked at the financial terms. And either for that reason or some other, Franklin will thenceforth refuse to answer William's letters. So it's a very sad end. It seems William is doing everything he can to, on some level, apologize or at least fit himself back into his father's affections. And Franklin isn't having it. He's really not interested. Temple will at one point tell his father that he thinks it's because William had balked at the financial terms, and that was the reason for Franklin's disaffection. And the only other mention that exists in Franklin's correspondence is a later letter in which he says, "I have a son, but he has kept himself estranged." I'm mangling the wording a little bit, but he makes it sound as if it's William who has kept his distance, when in fact it was he, Franklin, who kept his distance. And the two of them never reconcile, which puts everyone else in the family in an incredibly awkward position. But it's a pretty devastating end to what had started out like a kind of buddy movie.
Wow. I think it was near the end of your book, I was reading that even though Franklin was a beloved celebrity in France, and that made him kind of suspect among his American countrymen, that you saw him as representative of American identity because of that kind of flexibility and improvisational character that he had in his years in France. What are those Franklin-like qualities you think America could benefit from embodying here in the 21st century? And how are we still engaged in some way in an improvisation around our identity as a nation?
Just a tiny little question there, right, Quina?
It's a tiny, tiny one, yeah.
A couple of things come to mind initially. First of all, Franklin, late in the French stay, Franklin publishes a little pamphlet, or he writes a little pamphlet, which is basically advice to people who are thinking of moving to America, because there has been this, tremendous fashion for moving to America. There's this obsession with things American. There's this feeling that, America represents a new world, and everyone wants to replant himself here. And in that pamphlet, Franklin, I think, defines America better than anyone has ever, at least in the 18th century, defined it, which is basically to say that this was a place where pedigree didn't matter and counted for nothing, and where people don't ask a stranger who he is, but they ask what he does or what he can do. And it speaks very much to Franklin, the youngest son of a youngest son of a youngest son, who was not, at least not traditionally educated. It speaks very much to his take on inherited privilege. He really does not believe in an elite which is inherited. He doesn't believe in hereditary honors. He, at one point, says that hereditary honors are like having hereditary professors of mathematics. It makes no sense whatsoever. He blasts the laws of primogeniture. He offers up a hilarious, in a letter that he drafts to his daughter, he offers up a hilarious mathematical proof of how blood is diluted over generations. And he proves that you could too easily imagine how many rogues and fools and scoundrels and prostitutes end up as part of your progeny. So, he's the most deeply democratic of the headline founders in any case. So in that respect, he really typifies, I think, what many of us like to think of as a sort of baseline America. Two qualities that are on vivid display during the French years are compromise, which you also see with Franklin at the Constitutional Convention, where he is the master of compromise and the person who kind of hoops the barrel and manages to bring conflicting factions into accord one with the other. And he does a great deal of that in France, where obviously he's having to somehow bring together two groups, people who believe deeply in aristocracy and people who are underwriting a revolution, and make this the revolution in a republic, and make these different pieces work together The other though, and I think this is perhaps most vital to us today, is tolerance. I mean, it's Franklin who reminds us that you could be a patriot, but it doesn't mean that you have to be a nationalist. You can believe in America without discrediting the rest of the world. It's a fairly new concept in the 18th century. It's one we tend to lose sight of sometimes today. He's very much of the same school as Voltaire, who said it's lamentable that to be a good patriot, you might have to become the enemy of the rest of mankind. He's extremely open-minded, and that is what makes him such a master diplomat in those years.
Stacy, I want to follow up with that question because there's a section in your book that I was laughing out loud, actually. Sort of the French impression of Americans, and I'm gonna read from it. It says here, "The mercantile spirit infected everything. The mania for commerce was inexplicable. America was a cultural wasteland, its people devoid of conversation." What you just said, I heard it. It in some ways is idealism for me. In looking at where we are today, we talk about making deals instead of diplomacy. We talk about transactional relationships, even the personal relationships. Well, what do you bring to the table? Yeah, it's one thing how you see yourself, but it's also there's a part of it that includes how others perceive you. How does this become part of that identity that we've just been talking about, that Benjamin Franklin was describing in the pamphlet or where we are today? How the French perceived Americans.
I had a really good time with that. The French volunteers who come to America, all of them write vivid and detailed letters home about what they find here. And remember that this is a moment where America is not on anyone's radar. No one's really sure where it is on the map. The country is considered about as important as the island of Corsica. Um, it's either near Turkey or near India. Nobody's really completely sure of the geography. Some French volunteers think they're going to get here and meet panthers in the streets. I mean, it's very little understood. And the Frenchmen who come are just mystified by this country in which judges till their own fields and people all believe themselves to be equal one to the other. There are no titles. There's no aristocracy, or there's little aristocracy. Um, and they write this with a sort of, does this fuel the French Revolution? They write of this with a sort of passion, on the one hand, for the equality, and with a dread of some of the things that it implies. So there's a real sort of mix there. I mean, when I say, the food was bad, the coffee was bad, the women weren't flirtatious enough, there were so many things that were wrong with America, but this abiding sense that everyone essentially was on the same footing and everyone essentially lived at the same level. There aren't any palaces, but nor is there any poverty. There's a real sense of this is a middle class superpower. Um, I think that very much jives with what we still think of as America, as a land of opportunity, where opportunity is of equal access to everyone, or is meant to be anyway, and where everyone has an equal chance of success.
Yeah. And what you do and what you contribute is more important than how you were born, even though we do have conversations these days about Nepo babies more and more.
But that's such a new twist, I think, and that is so much.
Yeah.
It's funny that the French dukes and marquises who come here, with all of their titles, are just flabbergasted that you can have a society in which people aren't titled.
Well, let's go back to the Franklin series. You were an executive producer and you advised the creators. What was your most memorable experience from working with the Franklin series?
That was a really joyous collaboration. I don't know how or why, but all of the pieces were sort of just sort of sunny. The reason the production looks so gorgeous is because it was filmed where it took place originally, which is to say in the halls of power in Paris and in Versailles. So on Mondays, the Palace of Versailles is closed to visitors. And so on a couple of Mondays, the production was allowed to film there. And so to be at Versailles when the only other people in the place, in the chateau, are all people working on a production about the 18th century, was really thrilling, but especially watching these just brilliantly costumed actors and actresses walking around with these towering wigs on their head and their cell phones in their hands was about as good as it got.
Yeah, unfortunately, another fate was lurking after this revolution wrapped up for them. But
Exactly, and they didn't have cell phones to call for help.
exactly.
I mean,
No, they did not. Oh,
the entire
sad.
cast would have a cell phone in one hand. They're dressed in 18th century garb, and their wigs would reach the ceilings. And in one hand, they would have a cell phone, in the other hand, they would have a cigarette. And it was just such a perfect, I kept taking pictures of this because it just was such a great contrast.
Now, as we reflect on the 250-year history of the founding of this country, the United States, how do we as a nation move away from myth, as we've been talking about today? Because until this series and reading your book, I had no idea about Benjamin Franklin being a diplomat and being the key to getting France um, involved in the American Revolution. So how do we move away from myth and embrace the lessons and the messy realities to become a more perfect union, in your opinion?
Well, I'm going to give you the historian's answer, which is that telling the story straight is always preferred, and can be done with great difficulty, but it can be done. Had we understood from our earliest days how much we owed to the rest of the world, there surely is a way to make that tally with American exceptionalism. This would have been a lovely balance to have maintained. This was a really international effort, and America takes its place on the world stage thanks to a number of other nations. There's so much in those years that is really the sort of DNA of where we are today. And you can hear it in a lot of the letters that Franklin writes. They're sort of anthem after anthem that Franklin will write. He's isolated in Paris. He's out of touch, as I said, with Congress. He's surrounded by French spies. They're surrounded by British spies. He's very much kind of distilling what he sees in the distance. He's, remember, never set eyes at this point on an independent America. And he's writing about it as the sort of asylum for people in the world, an asylum that gives great joy and great hope to other peoples. And he pretty much kind of pointedly articulates what I think we would call American exceptionalism. He says to Congress, and then in a different context to Washington, the American cause is esteemed the cause of all mankind. We're fighting for the dignity and the happiness of human nature. And then I think he says, glorious it is for the Americans to be called by Providence to this post of honor. So it really is this cry of American exceptionalism, but there really is the belief that that's our investment and that's our mission, and we'll do whatever it is, whatever expedient thing we need to do to arrive at that.
Okay. Well, thank you, Stacy, for joining us in this conversation about your book, A Great Improvisation, and the series Franklin, which was inspired by your book. It's a great series. We highly recommend it, and it's a great book. Just reading it, Benjamin Franklin has become a much larger figure other than the man who, quote, discovered electricity.
Yeah. And we want to add that your book is included in our page to screen recommendations for summer reading and beyond as well.
Wonderful.
So we really did enjoy it.
Thank you. There are worse places to spend time than 18th century Paris, I have to admit.
Well, you actually piqued my curiosity next trip to France, hopefully, that I can visit some of those places, because history makes all of the places you visit much richer. It's almost like you're seeing the layers of identity of a place when you know its history.
Exactly. And it's easy to find where you can follow Franklin's trail in Paris, which is also thrilling.
The 2024 miniseries Franklin, based on Stacy Schiff's prize-winning book, A Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America, and featuring Michael Douglas as Benjamin Franklin, is streaming on Apple TV with a subscription. Do a search for other streaming sources to enjoy the Franklin miniseries. Stacy Schiff's book, A Great Improvisation, is one of historical drama with the Boston Sisters' 9/2026 From Page to Screen book picks. You can purchase A Great Improvisation from our affiliate bookstore on both the From Page to Screen and Revolution to Rights bookshelves. Go to our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters to find the link to the affiliate bookstore and on the webpage for this podcast.
Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your favorite podcast platform so you won't miss another episode. We wrap up Season 5 in July with another Revolution to Rights America at 250 podcast. Our guest, Lawrence Hill, talks about his 2007 historical novel, The Book of Negroes, the inspiration for the 2015 miniseries that premiered on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and BET in the United States. The story is told from the perspective of Aminata Diallo, a woman who is abducted as a child from her village in West Africa, sent to live as a slave in South Carolina, and forges her way to freedom, serving the British in the American Revolutionary War. The Book of Negroes gives us a window to an undertold story about the American Revolution.
Thank you for catching this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. We hope you enjoyed our exploration of captivating historical films and series dramas. Find us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters.
We want to hear from you. What historical dramas are you watching? Share your favorites. We may feature them in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe. Visit our website at michonnebostongroup.com/Boston Sisters and share the podcast with fellow historical drama enthusiasts.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michonne Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michonne Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michonne Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening.